Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Liberian History Channel. My name is Dennis Ja, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In Liberian history tonight, we're going to be talking part two of the birth of the African Republic, and that's Liberia. My guest here is Carl Famila. Carl, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you so much, Dennis. It's always a pleasure to be here.
And it's exciting to discuss history, and I'm happy that finally the Liberian History Channel is born, and we're going to be talking Liberian history most of the time. And I'm happy to have a scholar, a historian, also FOL public policy analyst, Carl Family. And for those of you who don't know the difference between Kou and Carl, let me tell you. A lot of people are used to call, but there is also call, and they have brothers and sisters, if you want to put it that way.
Twins. It's the same name.
They are twins, conjoined twins at that rate.
Same name, yeah, same name, regional pronunciation differences. That's
exactly. Exactly. And tell me a little bit about that regional pronunciation so that this is history.
Well, I mean, so my grandmother, we're from Ghana, and my grandmother drags, our people drag, the call is call, and people in Upper Nimba, they say call, but our people say call, so we drag it out a little more. We don't have the same accent with everything. It means exactly the same thing, same name. But just for the cultural authenticity and to identify with my clan, it's call.
And both mean the first daughter of the woman.
Yeah. So we have a matrilineal heritage, which means that your lineage is traced through your mother. And we have in the Mon culture, we have what you call place names or birth order names. So Kaw is not really a name as much as it is my order of birth. And so that would be followed by another name. So I'm Kaw Yeyia. And other, my sister is called Kagengba, and then you've got Call Minakal. I mean, we plenty, but only the mother's first child is given the birth order name. The father is not relevant to that process.
Right. Well, there you have it. And the Kisi have the same thing, they have Sia has the first. On the male side, they have
Sa is say, and so on.
Okay, welcome to the Liberian History Channel. We're going to be discussing part two of the birth of the African Republic. Last week, when we did part one, we started with the history of Duko, Cape Masurado, and we said, Call to us that was significant because the modern Liberia began from there. There where the people came and settled. And also, by the time they came there were other people there. And so she has a name that she has popularized, Sovereign African, meaning the people there were sovereign. They were not under any bondage. And then we also talk about the various ships that arrived and how the first two came through Shebru. Before then, there were Europeans have traveled to that part of what we know today of West Africa. Long before, dating far back as 1461, there was a timeline here. And also there were various invasions, people settling there and adapting the language of those who they met. So, Carl, did I do a good job with the review?
Very good summary. I I approve this message.
Today we're going to go into part two. But before we start that, I have some questions on my mind, even though has to... we may cover some of these things, but I wanted to first start with, at this time, we say the birth of the first of the African Republic. So while this thing going on, what really was going on in Africa and also Europe and America, where these people coming from? So briefly, let's set the stage with that.
So you have a situation, and actually the slideshow sets that stage pretty thoroughly. But in quick summary, you have a situation where the United States of America is holding, human beings in captivity, in perpetual bondage. Slavery is still a thing. It's still legal. It's before the U.S. Civil War. And you do also simultaneously have, especially in the northern states, in fact, only in the northern states, you have free people of color, free people of African descent. Some of them are descendants of former enslaved people in the Americas, and a good number of them are descendants of people who were rescued after the transatlantic slave trade became unlawful. There were still in 1808. There were still ships, illegal slave ships, smuggling human beings, trafficking human beings to the Americas. Why? Because their slavery itself was still legal. So there were still, even though the transatlantic, the introduction of new Africans to the West, to the United States was unlawful, because America still had slaves or people enslaved, excuse me, it was still lucrative for people to smuggle new captives into the Americas. In fact, after 1808, this continued for an additional 50 years. Those people, if they were fortunate enough to be detected, they would be rescued and then they would be released through tribunal. So you had a lot of chaos, a lot of illegal human trafficking at this period. Africa was not yet colonized, so you had a lot of traditional rulers still intact. However, Africa had been devastated and areas had been grossly depopulated by the transatlantic slave trade, which had been going on for about 200-300 years. So you had a situation where mass amounts of people, mostly young people, had been ripped out of West Africa mainly, and other parts of Africa, but West Africa felt the brunt of it, and taken into the New World. It was so rampant that whole ethnic groups, whole language families were erased from the face of the earth. So it was not some one-time thing. It became a way of life for centuries, and this was devastating to the population, to the culture. Imagine the impact of our Civil War that was so short, what that had on our culture, and imagine a few hundred years of perpetual war. In our traditions in Liberia, in the oral history, they refer to they have a phrase, a term that translates into rolling wars, meaning rolling wars that just continue to happen. And the people in the north have that, the Mano, the Loma, various ethnic groups talk about these in the tradition, the oral tradition, the period of rolling wars. This is something that stems from the transatlantic slave trade. It's not unique to the Grain Coast. It was all over West Africa. So they were.
Sorry. So, and it's funny you said that because they stopped the transatlantic slave trade. They don't want new, but slavery is still going on.
Right.
And so, anytime we speak of people coming to Liberia, let's take a step back and know who were these people. From the history I did in elementary school, it seems to me that time that people were free. And now, as soon as they were free, maybe 2-3 months or few years later, they say, okay, we don't want to let go. But that was not the case. The people sent to Liberia, most of them were born free. So tell me the, I don't want to say category of people, but the people that went to Liberia to settle, to be there now, we know those that were there.
Yeah, so originally, the first few vessels, most of those people, almost all of them, just 2 or 3, were not born free. Subsequently, you had like the Mississippi Colonization Society, where they emancipated a whole plantation and sent all of them to Liberia. So you do have situations where enslaved Africans who were laboring on plantations in North America were liberated for the specific purpose of sending them to Africa. A very prominent family in Liberia that was a benefactor of this is the Uris. The Uris descend from the mulatto children, or the mixed race children. I'm using the term mulatto because that's what you read that a lot in 19th century literature, but I apologize, I don't like the term. The biracial children of a plantation owner and his enslaved African enslaved concubine had numerous children. He had numerous children with these women, and when he died, he willed that his it's children, because in that time, your status as a slave was dependent on your mother. So if your mother was a slave and your father was a plantation owner, you were also a slave. So at that time, the plantation owner, when he died, he willed that the Uri family be repatriated to Liberia, and he gave them quite a generous amount of money and resources, clothing, and other things so that they could start their life. He also sent other slaves with the Uris to Liberia. So there's various stories. The stories are complex. But initially, majority of the people who returned were already born into freedom. They were northern freed blacks, missionaries that were going there to be missionaries. And most importantly and significantly, and I emphasize this because this is a group that's been lost or initially or intentionally probably omitted from history, which is the recaptured Africans. Numerous recaptured Africans who were liberated because they were rescued from illegal slave trade and then returned to Liberia as well. For example, those who established New Georgia were actually not from Georgia, but they were rescued from a slave vessel. They were held in tribunal in Savannah, Georgia for 3 years. And then when they were returned to Liberia, they created a settlement called New Georgia. And most of those people were what they call of the Ebo ethnic group, and others mixed in. But the majority of those captives, those recaptured Africans, were Ebo, which is a branch of the Yoruba speaking people.
Wow. So the recaptured Africans, let's speak a little about that, because what we read most of the time in Liberia was those were recaptured from the Congo Basin. And that's why we have the Congo people. You were saying there were some that were recaptured. Even they already reached the shore of America and they were recaptured, went through tribunal, maybe Congress out of saying that, and then sent back to Liberia. So let's talk a little bit about those recaptured ones.
So yeah, there's numerous ships with recaptured Africans. The Saluda. There's lots and lots of stories. I mean, we could have a whole show just on recaptured Africans. But yes, when the United States was repatriating recaptured Africans, these were people that were rescued by U.S. Navy vessels mostly, and a lot of them were rescued in U.S. territorial waters off the coast of Key West, Louisiana, Savannah, Georgia, New York. I mean, this was an ongoing thing. I know everyone's familiar with the Great Amistad story that occurred in the 1830s. The ship where they had a slave rebellion. Those were Mendi people. And most of those people actually came from Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, where those three countries merged today. So they had Mendi, Kisi, Bandi people on that ship, and they rebelled, overcame the ship, killed everyone except 2 people, and demanded that they be navigated back to their home. They were tricked. They ended up in America. They had to go through tribunal, which is a trial. They were able to prove that they were born free in Africa, and they were repatriated to Sierra Leone. And that story of Amistad, I would want us to do a specific a show just about that, because that's very fascinating, and it ties into Liberia a lot. But we'll,
And when these people like those from that formed New Georgia, you said they were part of the Yoruba ethnic group.
Yes, Ebo.
Ebo, not the Igbo. The Igbo are different. This is Ebo.
Igbo is different from Ebo. EBOE.
All right. So why Liberia? Why were they not sent back to Nigeria?
There was no Nigeria. There was the Dahomey Empire. There was, Yoruba Empire, Igbo Empire. There were empires, and there was no Nigeria at that time.
Sure.
And if you had been, so they come from a place called the Oyo Empire, the Ebos. When Dahomey conquered Ebo, and you're talking about, tens of thousands of human beings. When they conquered the Ebo Empire, they took all of the desirable women and made them, their wives, or incorporated them into their society, and they sold another great number of the young people, the men and other women, into slavery. And so that's why you have so many Ebo people had been repatriated to Liberia and Sierra Leone, because the Dahomey king was just selling these people, and it was a free for all. So many of them were rescued and returned to mostly Sierra Leone, some Ebos, especially those who made it all the way to North America and were part of that whole Savannah, Georgia tribunal. They were settled at Liberia because they had come to the United States.
Right. And Liberia was what is known today as Liberia was set up for that purpose.
It
So
was set up as an asylum. It was set up as an asylum for liberated African people.
right. So all these people now they converge in what we call Liberia today, and we have different names. And I want us to kind of talk through some of these names. And
Okay.
you know already, I don't like the word freed slave because of the oxymoron there.
Right.
And, you say free and a slave. We have pioneers, we have settlers, African Americans, we have Congo people, American Liberians, we have natives, we have indigenous. But you have your own take about these names.
Well, I mean, I don't have my own take. I like to, people, the immigrants called themselves immigrants. The people who they called themselves immigrants. They didn't call themselves pioneers. That's a term that was coined much later, during the Tubman era, and it is really a derogatory term on so many levels. So I don't use the word pioneer, except that I'm referring specifically to the holiday that was created by President Tubman. The reason pioneer is derogatory is because pioneer implies that you're the first of someone to go somewhere, the first human to go somewhere. You are the first explorer. And these people did not see themselves as first explorers. They saw themselves as immigrants going back to their places of origin. And these were literate people. They could read and write. Hillary Teague never called himself a pioneer. Elijah Johnson never called himself a pioneer. Lot Carey never called himself a pioneer. And so imposing that term on people who were literate, were reading, writing, and describing themselves and their ambition, I think is offensive. We need to think about that. So they call themselves immigrants. They also sometimes referred to themselves as Americans, though they understood that they did not have rights in America. They were born under the American flag. And then there's another group that they referred to as Native Africans, which were the repatriated Africans. And then the people that are often referred to as Aboriginals or natives that were already living in the area, I choose to call them sovereign Africans. Aboriginal, native, these are somewhat derogatory in the context in which they were used. But the more accurate description of the people who were existing along the Grain Coast in other parts of Africa is that these people were sovereign. They were free, sovereign citizens of their various nations.
That brings me to another point, right? Because the bicentennial, I know we talked about this before, that people see the bicentennial, the arrival of the immigrants, as they called themselves that time, has the beginning of freedom for Liberia, right? And so people have been describing the bicentennial by different names, but the Africans that met on the soil were sovereign, and the Africans that arrived were also free. They were either recaptured
born
or
free,
born free, right? So the concept of 1822 being the beginning of Liberia's freedom has some questions.
Well, I mean, yeah. So Freetown, is in the process of celebrating the 230th anniversary of. Sierra Leone's in the process of celebrating 230th anniversary of Freetown, because Freetown is the settlement. They don't say Sierra Leone is 230 years old, because countries are recognized by their independence when they fly a flag, when they assert their self-determination, when they assert their sovereignty. Liberia was established in 1847. It was named after the colony of Liberia. The Republic of Liberia was established in 1847. Those colonies that were existing along the coast before 1847 no longer exist. They were abolished and the US flag was brought down and the Liberian flag was erected. This is why in 1947 we celebrated our centennial in 1947, not 1922. This is why Centennial Pavilion was built in 1947 and not 1922. And what happened in 1822 should be celebrated, but it should be accurately described as what it was. It was it was a beginning of a process that led to the evolution of Liberia. There were other settlements along the coast, one older, which is Freetown. They didn't become independent in 1847. They didn't become independent until, the 20th century.
Yeah.
Why is that? It is because there's a very unique story about Liberia. What is it that made us independent? And until we know that story, we won't understand why it's important for us to emphasize 1847 over 1822. But that being said, 1820, 1821, 1822, there were a lot of significant things that happened. We should discuss them today. I have a slideshow presentation that breaks a lot of things down. It is absolutely important that we celebrate the founding fathers, because they were in fact men of Liberia, and where they came from with the idea and the audacity to assert their independence during a time when their countries of birth were still holding human beings in bondage.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you are just joining us, this is the Liberian History Channel on Focus on Liberia. Today we are discussing the birth of the African Republic, part 2. We'll take a 30 seconds break. When we come back, Carl will go through the slide.
My name is Tolvina Cole. I am an activist, and you're watching Focus on Liberia.
Carl.
That was not 30 seconds. All right.
Okay, let's go to part 2 of our topic today, that is the birth of the African Republic, Liberia.
Absolutely. So I'm going to try to make this not as boring as, people hate slideshows, but I like them. I like the visuals. The repatriation of recaptured Africans, African Americans, and the voluntary assimilation of sovereign Africans. That is the theme for this slideshow. And it's important. And this is covering a period from 1820 to 1847. I'm going to go over some brief timelines before I get into the nitty-gritty. But we're talking about abolitionists, missionaries, and the resistance that led to Liberia, the establishment of a republic, the Republic of Liberia, which I'm very proud to be a descendant of. So we can go to the next slide. Do you have any questions on this slide? Any of these themes here?
Right. And this is 2 things: the repatriation of recaptured Americans, African Americans, and the voluntary assimilation of sovereign Africans. And there's a timeline to these things.
Yes.
Yeah, looking down there, the picture looks very scary. But let's go to the next slide. Maybe we'll explain that.
Well, I can explain it really quickly. So here we have on the far right, we have a missionary woman, freed African American missionary. In the center here, this is a slave chain gang headed towards the coast. This is a sketch that was taken in, or sketch of. This is supposedly within the Grain Coast area. So these are probably, our own ancestors and relatives here that were being sketched. So the very far left slide is from the Kingdom of Dahomey. And if you see, they're holding people on their heads to be sacrificed. And we have a lot of descendants of the victims of the Dahomey Kingdom living in Liberia that have become Liberians. And these are some of the Ebos that we're talking about, the descendants of the crushed oil empire. So this is what this is about.
And you see in that sketch, a very young child. So children were among the slaves.
Absolutely. In fact, especially later on, it became a thing it was easier to break a child. They had the U.S. and other plantations across the Caribbean ran into problems, buying these people like Sinke, like Sinke, whose name was actually Sengbe, but Sinke, who was the revolter, the head of the revolt on the Amistad. You're bringing these grown men that were warriors, they start rebellions. They know freedom. They know how to fight. They're willing to die. So the paradigm shifted away from, you know what, it's probably not a good idea to bring a bunch of these warrior men in chains, because they'll break their chains and they'll fight for their freedom. So they started focusing on children. It was much easier to break a child and enslave a child than a 25-year-old warrior.
Wow.
So we'll go to the next slide here. Basically, repatriation was a response to resistance, not sympathy. This is important. You know, people think that somebody felt sorry for these African people. They say, oh, it's so sorrowful, let's send them back, you know, free them and send them back. No, there were many factors, but the main factor for this repatriation movement was fear. They documented their concerns and their fears. These abolitionists didn't believe in the institution of slavery. While that's true, that doesn't mean automatically that you should deport citizens or others that have been liberated. The idea of repatriating them came out of the constant revolutions and rebellions that were going on. There were numerous violent slave revolts in the United States and the Caribbean. I just highlighted a few of the significant ones, the ones that shifted the course of history. Of all the slave rebellions that occurred, the homicide and many others, but I'm going to talk about the very early ones. The Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution, by far, was the catalyst for the repatriation movement of African people, and for this fear of a Black planet, fear of these Black people taking over their countries. So the Haitian Revolution also was the catalyst for the ending of the transatlantic slave trade, because they didn't want to keep introducing new Africans into the population and have what occurred in Haiti to happen in North America and other Caribbean islands, in England. They said, you know what, let's deal with the ones we have. We can trade the ones we've already broken. Right. But you're bringing more Africans, we're going to end up like what happened in Haiti, because Haiti had a huge population of Africans born in Africa, enslaved on the island. And it was much easier for those people who had been born in their sovereign states on the continent of Africa to fight for their sovereignty to the death, because they knew better than their condition. And so what happened in Haiti, the revolution 1791 to 1804, it was a process. It wasn't a one-day struggle. They decimated Napoleon's army. They killed, these guys were slaves. These guys were enslaved, and they fought and defeated the most powerful military on the planet. So the Haitian Revolution was not some little, rebellion. These men and women fought in this revolution. They pulled out of themselves the courage and audacity to overthrow their oppressors. And that basically, what I wrote here is, by creating a society, and then after they had the revolution, they created a society where all people were granted freedom. So everyone living within their territory was liberated. That did not, this is amazing. You're talking about 1804. This sparked all kinds of contention in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean, where people were still enslaved on sugar plantations. Here is Haiti saying, everyone is free, everyone is equal, everyone is a citizen. So the Haitian Revolution forever transformed the world. It was a central part of the destruction of slavery in the Americas. This was the catalyst that really destroyed slavery, though it took time. The Haitian Revolution was the battle cry for enslaved people in the Western Hemisphere. And therefore, a crucial moment in the history of democracy. It laid the foundation of freedom struggles for all people in the world. So this wasn't just about Black liberation. The Haitian Revolution set the tone for equality in democracy. They became a republic, the first Black modern state in 1804. And the next one on the timeline here is the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, which occurred in 1808. So Congress passes a law along with the English to stop the transatlantic slave trade out of fear. This is just 4 years after Haiti has declared itself a republic and slaughtered the most powerful military on the planet. The Haitians have said we're free. The Europeans and the Americans respond, you know what? Keep those Africans in Africa. Stop bringing them here. We've got enough. So 1808, they stop the transatlantic slave trade, but they do not free or liberate the enslaved people they're all holding in bondage in the Americas and in the Caribbean.
Because it was easier to even let them reproduce more slaves from those slaves instead of bringing in new ones.
Exactly. They started buck breeding in the Caribbean. So you've got Antigua and Barbuda. Barbuda was an island, which is part of the country of Antigua Barbuda today. Barbuda was an island that was used to buck breed. And this sounds so terrible, but it's what they did. They took the tallest, strongest men and the tallest, strongest women, and they put them on this island and they forced them to procreate and make babies. They did this all over the Caribbean, but the Barbuda story is one of the worst. Antigua Barbuda. So if you go to Antigua, you've got these giants, and it was intentionally done. They took people and forced them to reproduce for the sugar plantations. So 1808, we've got the slave trade abolished, and then so the German Coast Uprising of 1811 is profound. Let me tell you a little bit about this German Coast Uprising. So the German coast, in case you don't know, is basically Louisiana. You're talking about the Mississippi River. So it's they call it the German coast, and that's a whole history about why that is. But it's the United States. It's Louisiana. There was an uprising that occurred in 1811, where about 300 slaves organized and revolted, killing plantation owners and killing their oppressors. That was put down by the U.S. military. They killed some of them. They imprisoned and then later killed the rest of them, executed the rest of them. They took their heads, they decapitated these people and put their heads on posts in prominent places so people could see, to strike fear in the hearts of all, anyone else that wanted to rebel, and use them as an example. Took their dismembered corpses and put them on posts and put them on public display in response to putting down that rebellion. I mean, that rebellion of 1811 terrified Americans. I mean, it shook the fabric of the United States. So people are like, you know what? We can't have these freed blacks running around here inciting those who are enslaved to seek freedom. So part of this argument of repatriation was, we have these free people amongst us. You've got these Africans who are being rescued from slave ships and released, into the custody of Americans. And there's really, no end to this. We have to get rid of these people. Because remember, the 1808 Act was to stop the transatlantic slave trade, but it didn't stop. So people keep coming and the numbers of Africans keep increasing. So in 1819, and I highlighted this in green, you have, in 1819, and I highlighted this in green, you have the Repatriation Act. So you have some amendments to the Slavery Act, where now the U.S. Congress makes it legal to repatriate such captured Africans back to their place of birth. So it's the 1819 Act. You've got, also this bill allowed the use of armed cruisers on the coast of the United States and Africa to suppress the slave trade and return recaptured Africans to Africa. So this was two things. It not only allowed them to release or return the ones that were on U.S. soil, but anyone that was captured within U.S. territorial waters and the coast of Africa could be returned to Africa. And where is that they're going to be returned to? Liberia. So we can go on to the next. And simultaneously, of course, you've got, Sierra Leone doing basically, the same thing the British. Much of what we were doing in the United States was modeled off what the British had already been doing in Sierra Leone. So I'm going to give just a...
And Carl, before you go further, because it's important that we stress this. because your topic here it says they were repatriating these Africans not out of sympathy. They had to because of these rebellions, you know. So
I mean,
that's
that
that.
was that was there's always multiple factors. You know, there's not ever one factor that leads to things, but that is the main factor. If you had to name one principal reason, that would be it. Fear. But there were many other factors, but that's the recurring theme and the timeline and the narrative in newspapers and publications and speeches and all of that. The motive was to get rid of these free people because they were serving as an inspiration to the enslaved.
And they were always getting their energy from the Africans that were born there that were just being brought. They say, hey, what are you doing here? You're going to exile
Exactly.
these people? Come on, let's fight.
Exactly. So we'll get into this. I wanted to do a quick timeline of the colonization societies. I think another misconception is that, there's just the American Colonization Society. There were actually numerous colonization societies that later merged and numerous independent colonies along the coast, the Grain Coast. So it wasn't just one acquisition of the American Colonization Society. And it all began with the first.
Why were they called this name, Colonization Society? Were they colonizing people?
So the word colony has two definitions,
Okay.
right? So the first definition would be, what we think of as a colonizer, someone who goes politically colonizes another territory and imposes their laws and rules and policies upon those people. The second definition, which is what applies to this situation, is a settlement of people. Colony just basically means a settlement of people. So that confuses people a lot. They say, well, the guy American Colonization Society, so Liberia was colonized. No, it's just a settlement of people. In 1792, you have what's called the very first African repatriation, organized, I should say, African repatriation movement is organized by what's called the Sierra Leone Company. The Sierra Leone Company is a private British venture. It is not, owned by the British government. So this is not the colonization of England imposed upon Africa. This is a private philanthropic organization of English people that call themselves the Sierra Leone Company. That's an important distinction because later on in here, we have the Berlin Conference, and then that's a different thing. Now we're talking about government saying this is now our territory. This country is owned by this country. This is long before that. That distinction is extremely important to understand the timeline of history. So,
and who are these people? The Sierra Leone Company? Were they white
British?
people?
Yeah, British philanthropists. I'm sorry, abolitionists.
And why Sierra Leone? Why was the name Sierra Leone?
So the place had been called Sierra Leone by the Portuguese. Many said, just like Cape Mesurado was called Cape Mesurado for many centuries. So what they're actually, the Sierra Leone Company is actually, they purchased land that they called Freetown, but that area was called Sierra Leone long before the British even went there. It was the Portuguese that named it Sierra Leone. The same time Liberia was named, not Liberia, but Duco was called Cape Mesurado. The same time they called Wakonka Cape du Monde and what we call Cape Mount. So they named all those places, the Kavala, all those places in the 15th century, long hundreds of years before this, to at least 200 years before. So the Sierra Leone Company established Freetown in 1792, and that's, so 1816, you had, before the American Colonization Society, you have the Maryland State Colonization Society. So the Maryland State Colonization Society preceded the American Colonization Society by a year.
Okay.
And then 1817, and mind you, these two things, these guys are the ones pushing Congress to pass the 1819 law. They can't yet repatriate anyone. They're created for that purpose, but it's not yet legal for them to take, people out of America and repatriate them to Africa. But the idea is here, they organize a society, they start getting money and resources to lobby Congress to pass a law that allows them to send Africans back. 1817, the American Colonization Society is established. for the same purpose. 1828, I mean, so these two precede the law. Once the law is created, the ACS, the American Colonization Society, is the one that repatriated people on the Elizabeth, the Nautilus, the Brig Strong, the first three ships. 1828, this is going so well. Virginia creates its own colonization society. 1829, the state of Mississippi creates its own. I'm sorry, this is supposed to say New York. I apologize. 1829 should say New York Colonization Society. So forgive me, that's an error. 1829, New York, not Mississippi. So colonization society. So the Mississippi Colonization Society was 1831, and 1830 was the Louisiana Colonization Society. So you've got all of these different, competing places, going on the coast, negotiating for land with indigenous people, getting settlements structured and set up similar to what happened at Cape Mesurado, completely independent of each other, and using that area to repatriate people.
Right. So how do we look at these societies? Right, they're good people, mainly Christian, that say slavery is wrong, so we have to stop it and send African back to Africa? Or what was the intent here?
I don't look at history in terms of good and bad people. I look at history in terms of what happened.
Okay.
And then in documented motives. So these colonization societies, everyone at this period in time, pretty much. I mean, when I say everyone, of course, there may be some exceptions, but many, the world view of European Americans, Europeans in Europe, Europeans in the Caribbean, Europeans globally, was because of the slave trade. They had developed this ideology of white supremacy, of this concept that they were, superior. It's a false pseudoscience. It's, of course, nonsense, but this was their worldview. And their worldview was from a position of supremacy. They wanted to also impose their view of God and their view of appropriate religion and how to worship God upon the world. And so, is that good? Is that bad? It just is what it is. That's what it was. These people believed in, not only the cultural conquest because they thought they were culturally superior, but also believed that it was their bounden duty as the superior beings on the planet to liberate others from themselves, really, and make them more like themselves. So you've got a lot of these colonization societies had twofold mission: one, to return people to the place of origin, and two, to change and dismantle the culture and Christianize people.
Yeah.
So that was what it was. You can go to the next slide. So now we're looking at the very first ship, the Elizabeth, the famous Elizabeth that never went to Liberia on its maiden voyage. The Elizabeth settled in Sierra Leone. 86 immigrants, initially 88. One died, one refused to go, so it left the New York harbor with 86 people on board. 85 of those 86 were born free, a mixture of African Americans and recaptured Africans who had been residing in the United States. And once that 1819 law was passed, they had wanted about 200 people. The U.S. government wanted to return 200 recaptured freed Africans that were living in New York. They were only successful in, arranging for about 40. And then the rest were African Americans, mostly missionaries and people who volunteered to go and work and help set up the colony. Of all those people, 85 were free born again, and one purchased his own freedom and had moved north. And there were certain circumstances where enslaved people could work extra beyond what their required labor was and be able to liberate themselves if they had decent owners. So there were 40 deaths. This is important. Of the 86 people that were on the Elizabeth, 40 of these people died. And of the 86 people, 40 died. 35 were removed, meaning 10 returned to America, 10 survivors, and 25 refused to go to Cape Mesurado.
Let's do the math. Of the
So there should be
86,
8.
of the 86, 40 died. So the remaining there will be 26. So when you say 35 were removed.
No. 46. So 86, 40 died.
Yeah, so we have 46 remaining. So of that 46, 35 were removed.
Yeah. And of the 35 who were removed, 25 remained in Sierra Leone.
Okay.
And 10 went to the United States.
So 10 got back on the Elizabeth or some other ship.
Yeah, so there were always American naval vessels up and down the coast. You know, they were cruising, trying to capture slave ships and trading. There was still trade, you know, legitimate trade going on. So you could always hitch a ride. Like, for example, I'll talk about it a little later. You could always hitch a ride and go back to the States. So 10 of them were like, you know what? We don't want to be in Africa. We lied. Let we go back. And then 25 of them did not want to continue with the American Colonization Society. They preferred to remain in Sierra Leone. And one of the reasons they wanted to remain in Sierra Leone is important is because you had John Kizzle, which was an African American who had set up a whole settlement in Sierra Leone earlier, you know, and so he had a place they called Kizzleton or Kizzleton, and they were free. So a lot of these people were like, why are we going to follow these, you know, these white guys to another place when we can stay with John Kizzle in his settlement here? And, you know, you also had John Coffey or Kofi, who had, you know, altered his name to Coffee, but it was Kofi. He was from what is now modern Ghana. But he also had a settlement there. So there were people settled there, and they found that to be more of an attractive option than to move forward to, you know, Cape Mesurado when that other land was procured.
Right. And just to be clear, John Kizzle is actually what we read in the history book in Liberia, say John Kisse.
Oh, that's how they pronounce it. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, so that's basically how this works. And you've got where was I at?
Yeah.
Okay. So
these 25 remain and they refuse to go to Liberia, but the intent was to take all these people to like continue with them to Cape Mesurado. Is that what?
The original intent was for them to have a settlement at Sierra Leone, but John Kizzle, not only did they die, but John Kizzle and others didn't want ACS there. There's a long backstory. There's a bunch of journals that go back and forth, but there was contention, and they refused. They reneged on their promise. On one hand, they were saying they weren't paying them enough money for it, and you know, people just didn't want to be bothered. So they already had an issue with Freetown, the existence of Freetown. And so they were saying, hey, we don't want another Freetown here. So that's what forced Eli Ayers and Stockton to go further down the coast. Eli Ayers and Stockton went to Cape Mount, tried to negotiate, and King Siaka and others at Cape Mount were like, you know what? No, keep going, because they didn't want them to stop the slave trade. Because Cape Mount at that time and Galenas were areas with massive involvement in the illegal at that time transatlantic slave trade. So they didn't want a settlement of abolitionists, you know, in their territory. Yeah. They went all the way to Bassa, and they were granted land in Bassa, what is now Bassa Cove. And when they started arguing with the people, saying, hey, we'll stay here, but you guys have to shut down Trade Town. You cannot have slavery going on. They said, well, then y'all go somewhere else. You're going to stop our slave trade? You can't live here. You know, we refuse to honor the agreement, and they didn't give them back the gifts and whatever else they gave them in exchange. They just told them to keep moving. And the last place he went was Cape Mesurado, and it was John Mills, a mulatto native as they described it at that time, a mulatto sovereign African named John S. Mills, who finally said, you know what, you all can have Providence Island. And that's how the whole process of you know, Liberia began at its present location.
And Cole, let's because this whole concept or this idea that the Africans there that it meant there were still dealing in slavery, and as a result, they didn't want to see these abolitionists or free or ex-slaves being settled there. Most of the time, this is something that we as sovereign African, as you call it, or native Africans or indigenous do not like to accept.
Mm-hmm.
But history is history doesn't go by that. You say as it is. So
Just as say it as it is. I
you say
mean,
what happened.
yeah, there's the documentation and the evidence is overwhelming. I mean, even our own oral traditions support that. You talk about, Banja, the story of Banja from Cape Mount, or would it be Bomi? The story of Banja, saying, hey, y'all pretended to put me on a slave ship and he had to go on the slave ship and rebel and free people who you think were enslaving the people. It was, so we've got even in our oral traditions, this story. So the oral traditions, the documented written records all corroborate. I mean, it's something we don't want to accept, but it is what it is. It happened. It occurred. And like I said, I don't look at history in terms of good and bad. I'm looking at history in terms of these are things that happened, and these are things that made today what it is. We wouldn't be living in a world that looks like it does today if these events did not occur.
Yeah. Besides the Elizabeth, we have the Nautilus.
Yes, let's go to the next. I mean, yeah. So we're on the Nautilus, and this ship. This is what had one of my favorite people favorite people educators in the history of Liberia, which is Lot Carey. Lot Carey was on this vessel, 1821. This vessel also went to Sherbro. There were only 33 immigrants on board. 30 of the 33 were freeborn. 3 purchased their freedom. 19 of them died. 8 were removed, and those 8 remained in Sierra Leone, refused to go forward to Cape Mesurado. So out of the 33, 27 either died or refused to go forward to Cape Mesurado. This is really important because people talk about Elizabeth. Most of the people in Elizabeth never made it to Liberia. It was what would have been like about 7 or 8. I gotta go back and do the math.
Yeah.
Fewer than 10 of the people on Elizabeth ever made it to Liberia. But 2 of the people that were on the Elizabeth had a profound impact on Liberian history. Hilary Teague and Elijah Johnson. So of the 86 people on that Elizabeth, fewer than 10 made it to Cape Mesurado, and 2 of those few that made it to Cape Mesurado are, if anybody's responsible for Liberia being sovereign, it would be those 2 African American men. And we can talk about that on another episode, but that's very significant. I think the mindset of most Liberian people is that Elizabeth landed with all this huge bunch of people on it, they all disembarked, and the rest is history. That's not what happened. Most of those people in Elizabeth either died or refused to continue with ACS.
So the number that continue with the ACS could be maybe around. So again, the math here.
It was 8.
8 persons, including Lot Carey and.
No. Lot Carey was not on the Elizabeth. He was on the Nautilus.
No, I'm missing this whole thing. And that's Elijah Johnson and Teach.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the ship that Lot Carey was on, the Nautilus. 1821.
Yes.
And again, it remained in Sierra Leone, and the rest continued to Liberia.
Yes.
Let's look at this timeline of ships.
Yeah. So really quickly, okay, so you've got the Elizabeth, March 1820, lands at Sherbro with 86 people. We already talked about who perished, who didn't. The Nautilus, March 1821, with 33 people on board. We talked about in detail who perished and who didn't. After this, beginning with the Brig Strong, this is the ship that had Hootie Ashman on board. Hootie Ashman with 15 recaptured Africans. There was a total of 37 immigrants on the Brig Strong. 15 of them were recaptured Africans. All landed at Cape Mesurado. It was the Brig Strong was the first ship to land directly at Cape Mesurado with immigrants, and that occurred in August of 1822. So if any threaty ship, there should be any ship, replica of any ship at Providence Island, it should be the Brig Strong, not the Elizabeth, not the Nautilus. It should be the Brig Strong, because that's the ship that actually landed and disembarked 37 people, 15 of which were recaptured Africans. The next ship is the Brig Oswego that had 60 passengers on board. You had the schooner Fidelity. The schooner Fidelity, that was July 1823. We're going to talk about this a little bit in detail later. I'm going to just go through these really fast. And then you've got the ship Cyrus, you had 103. The Brig Hunter, 66. Okay, let me see. You guys can see what all this is, but basically, I'm just going to go through 66 people were on the, I'm sorry, the Brig Hunter had 103. 66 people were on the Vine. 32 people were on the Indian Chief, the ship called the Indian Chief. 150 people were on board the Brig Doris, the ship Norfolk. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on.
Right.
So go to the next slide. I'm not going to bore everybody with these numbers.
And this brig here is another name for ship, right?
Yes, brig means ship. Mm-hmm. Then you've got, you've got the schooner Randolph. You've got the Brig Nautilus comes back. You see that? So some of the ships return to Liberia with more, because they're chartering these vessels. You've got the Brig Nautilus comes back in 1828. So it finally actually lands at Cape Mesurado in 1828. This is the same ship that brought Lot Carey to Sherbro Island, what it would have been in 1821. And then you've got the ship Harriet. There was a ship called the Brig Liberia that landed in 1820, the Brig Montgomery. And now a lot of these ships, you're talking about not just African Americans, but recaptured Africans. The Carolinian, the Valador, the Reaper, the schooner Reaper, 1831. Go to the next slide. And so we're talking about some of these ships having significant numbers of people on board. One of the ships that had a huge number of people on board was the schooner Crawford, which had 328 immigrants on it. So you've got the Jupiter, the Brig American, the Hercules. I mean, Roanoke, this probably was owned by somebody in Virginia, the ship Jupiter, the Brig American, the Ajax, the schooner M. Mercer. This came from Georgia sometime in 1833, not certain of the month that it arrived. So some of these ships were not just landing at Cape Mesurado, but different colonies along the coast. Some of them were landing at Bassa, some at Maryland, some at Mississippi, some at the ship Louisiana landed at Louisiana. And so on. The ship Nunes, we can go on to the next one. I won't bore you guys with this.
Right.
If you
so
want,
these were ships that were going directly to Liberia now with immigrants.
Yes, both recaptured Africans and African American immigrants.
And mainly these are African American immigrants were mainly freeborn.
No. So now you're getting into a situation, as I said at the beginning of the show, where a lot of these people are now, like, for example, the ones that are going to Mississippi are people who are liberated directly from plantation. Okay. So now you've got a mixture, all kinds of stuff's going on. I mean, if you want to have a 10-hour show, we can have a 10-hour show. But this is just to give an overview and give an idea of the sheer number of ships that were rolling in. We could do a show about each ship and who was on the ship, and that would take up 2 hours to tell their stories, and where they landed and all of that kind of thing. So I'm just the purpose of this is just to show the names of these ships and how many people and what years they were landing and so on. And then you've got the bark. Bark is another name for ship as well. You've got the bark Hobart, the brig Groning, the bark Union, the Saluda. This is a show we can have all by itself. This was a ship of recaptured Africans. Horrible story. I mean, devastating story, that were finally landed at Liberia, and hopefully their descendants are still living amongst us. The ship the bark globe. I'm gonna, you know, get into the next one. You've got the Indiana, the Independence. I mean, just, you know, you can read these things yourselves. So some of these ships have hundreds of people on board. We're now looking at, these are actual sketches of, so this is before photography. You know, we're talking about the 1830s. This is before photography. People are taking sketches of what they see when they capture these ships and they bring them into the harbors of New York, Savannah, Virginia. These African people who were taken literally naked, stripped of whatever, if they had clothing, stripped of their clothing, taken on board, men, women, children, stripped naked. And this was the image that someone captured in a sketch and published in the newspaper. So as these ships rolled in, this is how the people were brought, not speaking any English, you know, from different groups. Sometimes they were picked up at different areas along the coast. Some of them could not communicate with each other at all. And this is how it looked when these people arrived in the harbor. Imagine how terrified they were. And some of these ships are arriving in the winter in places like New York, and they had no clothing. And casualties were immense. I mean, sometimes only a handful of people would have survived. We'll go on to the next ship.
And these people, the ship did not. This is we are not talking 2-3 days on the ship. This could be months.
Oh yeah, it took. I mean, even for someone to sail from New York to Monrovia, I mean to Duco, to Cape Mesurado, you know, you're talking about over 30 days, 45-day journey.
Yeah.
Now you're talking about people who've been captured, and sometimes there's transshipment going on. So you take them, you carry them to the slave factory at Galenas, you keep them at Galenas, then somebody else comes and purchases them from Galenas. They've been picked up, some in Bassa, some in what is now Ivory Coast, some in different places. They drop them all off in Galenas, where they're kept in these dungeons. And then somebody, or at Amina Castle or wherever. Well, Amina Castle had been shut down at this point because the slave trade was made illegal, but Galenas was still operating. Trade Town in like what is now Liberia was still operating, and you had them transshipped there. They would be kept, and then somebody else would come with a larger vessel, like a whaling ship, and they would stick them in the hull of the ship, and they would bring them across, and they would be pretending to be whaler ships or something else, and they'd have all these human beings stuffed in the ball of the ship for sale in the West. And it was horrible. It was a horrible situation for people that were were captured in this way.
I mean, you're going to take people to work for you, so why don't feed them so that and you know, make them comfortable so that they can be strong to work? But that's another
story. Yeah, and honestly, it became one of the horrible things that I read, I've understood with the transatlantic slave trade is it was so easy and so cheap to get new Africans from the coast that in places like Brazil, the plantation owners would rather work them to death and just buy more than to take care of them. It was easier to work people to death and just dump them in a mass grave and bring more than it was to strengthen them and take care of them.
Wow.
During the height of the slave trade.
Right.
So the next slide is basically the same thing. Yeah. So this is some recaptured Africans who were sketched. The survivors again taken to Liberia. So I'm going to tell a little story. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but there was let's see here. So how do I do this without boring everyone? So basically, there was the Soso people of Guinea. Hang on one quick second. I'm sorry. One second.
At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Ja.
Welcome back to Focus on Liberia. This is the Liberian History Channel. My guest, Mrs. Carl Famile. We are discussing the birth of the African Republic, that's Liberia. So if you're just joining us, welcome to the show. Carl, we'll continue with the slide here.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I apologize, everyone. I'm a mother of 4, so stuff happens. Yeah, so basically, I think the best way to just approach this, the Soso people of Guinea, there was a vessel that was with recaptured Africans that were rescued, and many of them were from the Soso people who I have highlighted in red. You see where Conakry is. If you see up towards the top, that's where, along the Rio Pongo River, they were rescued and they were redistributed. So a lot of times people would take them into their homes as servants, which is basically slavery again. But in return, they were supposed to, teach them English, educate them, and all of this kind of thing. What ended up happening is that they were later on, there was a Soso man named Wilkinson who worked on a merchant ship, I apologize, a merchant ship who spoke English well. It's important to note that a lot of the people living along the coast who were powerful, they could read and write and speak English, and their children were sent to school. They would often send their children on these ships to go abroad to be educated. This was a very, very common thing, and it goes way back. And we talked about this last time we did this, about the King Peters of Cape Mesurado. So Wilkinson was one of those educated Sosos who could read and write and speak English, and he also spoke Soso, and he came along and he interpreted for the people and said, hey, these guys want to go home. There's a whole story about it that I'll post. I think I'll post that on Facebook because it's a long read. But basically what it's saying is, they were young, most of them were young, and they were the remnants of survivors on the ship. They had decided they wanted to go home. So they were returned in the Fidelity, the ship called the Fidelity, which was one of the ships that I listed. But only 5 of them made it to Cape Mesurado. Majority of them were Soso, and all of the Soso were dropped off in Guinea. So that they could go back to their homes. What happened to them after that, I'm not sure. But it's a very interesting story. 5 of them were then later taken to Cape Mesurado because they had nowhere to go. So let's see.
So the Soso were not sent to Liberia. They were sent to Guinea.
The 5 that remained were not Soso, and their place of origin was not a safe place for them to return to. So they took them to Cape Mesurado, to Liberia. So their descendants are Liberian today. Okay. So I just had a little bit about the Soso. There's a Soso photo of Soso people that was taken in the 1950s. If you go to the next slide.
These are the one?
Yeah.
I think this instrument, I played that myself.
Yeah, that's a West African, pretty common in in most of our cultures, especially among the Mindi people, but all over. It's proliferated to everyone.
All right. So we've come to the end of the slide.
Yeah. So I try to cut the slide short because I go off on a tangent and we could be here all night. So I know you'd like to open up for questions. We're going to do another one in a couple weeks and we'll continue the story from there. We start talking about, now we can get into Hilary Siege and what, led to the convergence, the merging of the colonies, and how and who decided that Maryland should be independent and why, and how that influenced like what we call Liberia today, 1847, which came after Maryland. I think the next segment we can talk about the Revolutionary Marylanders and the actual republic itself. But this is all early pre-republic colonization. Who was all there? And one thing that I did not mention in the slideshow is that during this entire process, and I'll get into this, when we do the next show, but during this entire process, when people colonized, there were a lot of sovereign Africans who voluntarily integrated and lived among the colonists. So especially in times of turmoil, they would seek refuge if they had been defeated in war or anything else. They knew that the colonies were a safe haven. So in the early stages, like for example, when Gaetumba attacked King Peter's town and decimated that population, the remnants, King Peter and his surviving remnants of his clan, joined the colony. And those descendants all, adopted Christianity and English names, and their descendants probably think they went to Liberia on one ship, but they are descendants of King Peter's clan. So there's a lot of stories like that. Even when Trade Town was liberated, all of those people that they had in shackles from up the St. Paul River that were, liberated, joined the colony at Bath. A lot of them, then became Christian, and the legacy continues. So Liberia has always been this convergence of recaptured Africans, African Americans, and sovereign Africans in the beginning stages who voluntarily assimilated and basically gave up their culture and adapted these Western ways. The erasing of those people is something I'm very much concerned about, because it is important that the entire story is told. There's a misnomer that there was some kind of apartheid going on at that time, and that the documented history doesn't support that idea at all. In fact, the opposite is true.
When you say join the colony, walk me through that process. So
you have to first, when you talk about history, we don't want to look at history through our modern lens. You always want to look at history in the context of the time period.
Yeah.
So people were Christian, people were Muslim, and if you were Christian or Muslim, and anyone, because these are Abrahamian religions, and these are religions that are religions of conquest. These are religions that people adapted mostly through force, not through choice. It was imposed upon our people. So even the Muslim people, who existed much longer at Cape Mesurado and along the Grain Coast than Christians did, even the Muslims have a concept that if you're not Muslim, you're a savage, you're godless, you're inferior. And so the same thing with Christianity. If you're Christian and others that are not Christian, those are the unfortunate people that need to be saved. And so if you wanted to join the colony and you could not bring your traditional beliefs with you, part of that process meant you must now adapt the religion. So we will give you sanctuary, we will protect you from your enemies, but you have to now become like us. You have to live like us. The same thing they did to the recaptured Africans. Many of them didn't go speaking English, and so they had to be taught. And part of the process was, I'm going to now call myself John Smith. Right. And I'm going to, become a Christian. And whatever religion we were practicing in Ebo land, and Oyo Empire, is considered demonic, and we're not allowed to do those things. But as it will happen, many of the beliefs from other parts of Africa are very prominent in Liberia. The beliefs that we consider to be non-Christian, non-Muslim, and evil, or whatever we label these things as. There's a lot of even secret societies that have been transplanted by recaptured Africans to Liberia, to what is now Liberia. So that's a different show. Yeah. But yeah, so
and
there's
Cora asked that question because sometimes people watching the show may look at these as things that happened long time, like
Mm-hmm.
people were joining the colonies and leaving their own cultural beliefs behind.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1930s, the missionary went in my hometown, and till today, maybe because of the war now, the town was divided into three. We have the mission where the Christians live, meaning white Christians. They had some orphans, people that became evangelists, all live on the mission.
Mm-hmm.
Then near the mission, there's a stretch we used to call it over, and that
Mm-hmm.
town became those who became Christian, but still, they were not on the mission, but that was the extension of the mission, and it became over because as the missionaries spoke, they said, "Oh, I'm going over there. I'm going over." So we started, and then there is a place where we live called, yeah, it was divided into four. So there is another region, another place that we call the town.
Mm-hmm.
So this was the place that the traditional belief of the people resided. So those that there, they were not Christian. They didn't go on the mission. So these things, this is as late as the 1980s.
Yeah.
And so the idea
So
that people were graduating from their culture and joining Christianity did not only happen on the coast, it even continued far along, the coast,
yeah.
also in the hinterland.
And interestingly enough, the process of acculturation was different depending on which colonization society it was. So Maryland had a completely different path from Liberia, from what happened at Cape Mesurado. So you got the Maryland Colonization Society was not separating its population from the Grable people.
Yeah.
They were actually, you would have a neighborhood of recaptured Africans, a neighborhood of African American repatriates, a neighborhood of Grable, sovereign Grables, all living basically in the same place. That didn't happen at Duco.
Yeah.
So when we do the next episode, I have a theory about why, Maryland was the first to assert itself as independent. And some of that has to do with the fact that everyone was living in such close proximity. But we'll talk about that the next show.
Yeah.
But Maryland was set up completely differently.
Right.
So
And
that whole
we'll do a separate show on Maryland, because I was
Mhm.
talking to one a Marylander and say, well, you see, the rest of Southeast Liberia like to force us to think a certain way, that the settlers or the American Liberians were bad. But our experience in Maryland was different. So we are not like the other Southeastern Liberians. We are not fighting the Congo people. And I'm putting it the way I was told. So
Mhm.
Maryland is very unique in this way, and I'm interested to. There is another a friend who is doing a complete research on Maryland, just Maryland, and
Mhm.
there's some very interesting find, and they would like for us to talk about that. We're
Yeah,
going to go.
Maryland. Yeah, Maryland. I call them the Revolutionary Marylanders.
Yeah,
It's a fascinating history.
we're going to go into comments, and you can also call. The phone number is in the ticker that is on the screen, 6053136004. We have 10 minutes left if we can squeeze all that in, and the code is there. Call. In the meantime, there are some comments here that we want to read. A lot of comments. This one is for Milfy Deco, and every time I think of Milfy Deco, Milfy is one of those who is saying, "What are we doing here? We should be in Liberia." So we are working on it, Milfy. He said, "Call, do you have a book of your detailed collection and explanation of Liberia's foundation?"
Not yet.
Not yet. And you can also get in touch. Carl can point you in the direction of some of those literature that she's reading. And they have the Liberian History Guild that she's part of. So these are all resources, people coming together to talk about Liberian history. And you could probably be a part of that and read some of the same sources. We got a smart and intelligent call on. Just love to hear her speak. That's from G. Gwen John Smith. Troy say my favorite boss, Carl Famula. Glenda say hello. Evis is watching. Jeremiah say, Kido say thank you, my sister. And that's the thing that is not
my
fair.
brother.
Elvis says the Oyo Empire and the Benin Empire fell to the more advanced Fulani Empire.
What?
Ariola said fascinating history. Midfield is saying, thanks very much, Carl. You are taking some of us back to reading the book called Ancient Africa. Elvis Morris, I think one thing that has been lost in our history is that a lot of native African slave traders were Muslim. Francis Sayer, which group of people in Liberia are now referred to be the Ebo people, if I may ask?
Congo. We just say Congo.
Yeah, we put
Congo.
all of them
We
in
just say
that
Congo. We just say Congo.
So I almost said the same thing that he says. They are still making Haiti to pay for it today. So Haiti is still paying for rebelling. And that's why,
So is Liberia.
yeah. Oh,
And so is
too.
Liberia. Yeah.
So it baffles me that African continent refused to allow Haiti into the African Union, barring the fact that Haiti isn't located on the continent. Their ways and mindset is African in nature. They are us.
Absolutely. They're the precursor of Liberia. They're the precursor of every freedom fight in Africa, and every independence struggle owes its origin to Haiti.
Joy M. Cooper Burnett, of importance, I believe, is the ship Harriet, on which J.J. Roberts traveled, but I heard no mention of him. My forefathers, many Coopers, were also on the Harriet.
Mm-hmm.
A very good program, brilliant research, and excellent presentation. Focus on Liberia. Great work. Keep it up. As from Miguel Derek. Ados Soli, very few Black Americans settled in Liberia. Almost none.
That's not true. That's not true. Plenty. So is that all the comments?
Oh, there are more comments, but we want to give you some calls now. If you can.
I just wanted to address a couple comments really quickly, if you don't mind. Yeah. So the ship Harriet wasn't until 1829, and I was only referring in detail to the first three vessels because of time. Of course, the very first Black governor of Liberia and ended up being the first president after liberation in 1847. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, but he did not arrive until 1829.
Telly Brown said profound knowledge being attained tonight, and Telly is asking about how many made it to Liberia before 1847. And Telly, you saw the list of ships they were carrying people. I don't know if Carl has a number.
Yeah, I mean, I can get into the number of survivors, and we can go into a tally of the number of people that arrived. What's more important, unfortunately, I have to say it this way, is who survived, not who arrived, and that number is incredibly smaller. The African-born repatriates, the African-born recaptured Africans, the African-born immigrants who were rescued from slave ships had a much higher survival rate. So majority of the people in Liberia that we call Congo are actually recaptured, descendants of recaptured Africans. Many, many African Americans arrived, and many did not survive.
Eva is asking, say, were all of the Liberian native ethnic group involved in trading slaves?
Yes. Evidence I've seen shows that everyone in some way or form was involved, not necessarily in selling slaves, but in capturing humans in war and then giving those humans to slave traders to be disposed of on the coast.
Right. And one thing I always like to, when I think of this time, is I think of the Liberian Civil War, where, wicked people are doing things. And so it really does not cast any aspiration or blemish on everybody, because in every ethnic group or in every group there are still bad people. There are people on the fringe of society, and all these things will go on. So I too want to believe that many other ethnic groups were involved, if not all.
It definitely was all. Definitely, there was nobody immune to warfare, and warfare was a process of getting human captives. And even if, you know, my great grandfather captured, you know, some Pella or Loma people and sold them to, you know, a Mandingo trader, he didn't carry them to the coast, but he could have sold them to a Mandingo trader who did carry them to the coast. So it was a whole network of interconnected, you know, evil, really. But again, this is my modern mind passing judgment on the past. Those things were actually, you say that it's fringe edge, but it was so commonplace that it was normalized among the powerful,
And there is also this school of thought that some of these people didn't even know that they were selling slaves. Okay, so the concept of pawn and the concept of trust, you know, led them to give people away, not knowing that they were going to sell them in the transatlantic slavery.
So that is complete. So that diminishes people's humanity, and I want to caution us about thinking that way, because these people were not stupid. They knew what was going on. The process even to transport people to the coast was so horrific. People died walking to the coast. So to say that they didn't know that this was horrible hell they were putting these people through, it's just it's born of this racist ideology of a noble savage. You know, the savage is too simple-minded to do evil or to do wrong. It's like how they treat children. Oh, the children are innocent. Africans are human beings. Africans are human beings, and we're complex just like all other human beings. We're not children. Our ancestors were not children, and we're not idiots. Some of them were actually wicked. And, you know, we need to just accept that. You know, so say, oh, they didn't know. They knew what they were doing. Look at the kingdom of Dahomey. Look at what the chiefs were doing on the coast when ACS was trying to buy land. They knew what they were doing. Does that mean everybody on the coast was benefiting? Of course not. But there were always those few leaders that were profiting and enjoying the benefit of the wrong they were doing. And evil is not the property of one group of humans.
Thank you. And Evans, it's always a thing about the seaside gribble and the bush gribble. Evans, let's get our callers now. And Evans Morris is the first caller. Evans, and I don't know what you mean by that. Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, quickly, thank you again for taking my call, Mr. John. Just to kind of get into it, I'm sure you probably heard about this before, but, you know, the seaside gribble, when they were coming to Liberia, you know, when they travel over the river, they deem themselves superior to those of the bushside gribble who travel to the forest to come to current day Liberia. So there's always a superiority complex there with those both groups. I'll just make it a little fun. But let me get to my question. Again, thank you, Mrs. Call, for really, you know, bringing this series to us. I really appreciate it. You know, obviously, I left Liberia when I was only 10 years old, so I really didn't learn a lot of these things in Liberia. And of course, being in the States, you don't get to a Liberian history in school, of course.
And Evans, if you were even further before you left Liberia, you still wouldn't learn it. Go ahead.
That's probably true. Yeah, I'm saying, like, most of the things that I learned and some of the things that she's bringing up is just probably by my own research and just trying to go back and, you know, connect with the history of our country. But, like, the question that I asked, and I think she kind of answered it already, I was really trying to understand, you know, we have this collective guilt that we share with, you know, our ancestors, those who we were told were slave traders. And, you know, it's almost like the thing with the white Americans where they feel like they shouldn't be held responsible for what their ancestors did. They were a part of, you know, being slaveholders. So for some of us who are coming from those tribes who were perhaps involved in slavery, you know, you kind of get you get taken aback thinking that your ancestors were slave, you know, traders, and it kind of makes me feel bad when I think about it. So I want to ask Carl what she feels about this whole history as she's unfolding it. I think she's from the Mon group, which she said was involved in it as well. So what is her thought on, you know, being a part of an ethnic group that was involved in slave trade? You know, it's a bit complex the way I feel about it, I want to get her take on that. So thank you again for taking my call.
Thank you. Cole, are you going to apologize for slavery?
Well, so this thing of
It seems
collective guilt, let me let me
that
let me just let me just say this. When people talk about collective guilt in America because of slavery, they're not necessarily even talking about the biological descendants of the Europeans that were, slave plantation, the European Americans who had plantations. They're talking about those who immigrated to America in the early 20th century, late 19th century. The Germans and people that came in like 1906. They didn't own plantations, but when they talk about collective guilt, they're talking about the benefactors of white supremacy. They're talking about the people who enjoy undue privilege because of the legacy of slavery. They're talking about those people who enjoy undue privilege. In Liberia, nobody is enjoying undue privilege. In Africa, for the most part, with the exception of some people in Nigeria and other places, right? But for the most part, there's no one in Liberia enjoying undue privilege because of the legacy of slavery. I mean, my husband's family, the Fambulas, you could argue that, HB Fambula Sr. was very rich and powerful because his great-great-grandparents were selling human beings and they positioned him well. You could also argue he was powerful because he came from a royal family, a royal lineage. The Massaquays, for example, But today, there's not really a whole ethnic group. You can't say all Bai people, enjoy undue privilege because of the legacy of the slave trade. You can't even say all Massaquays do or all Fambulas do. But you do have a small slither percentage of the population that may be still, through legacy, the Dukelis and others, maybe still benefiting. That's a different show. But I think it's a little bit warped to look at oppressed people who may be descendant of people who engaged in terrible things and say that somehow there should be collective guilt. Any guilt they would have had has been washed away because there is no privilege resulting from any wrong that was done. They have no lasting benefits from there. It's not like all the Madingo people or all the Soso people or all the Fulani people are millionaires because their ancestors sold each other into slavery. No.
Right. And if you even look at it critically, people, as you say, a lot of people in Liberia, almost all, did not benefit. They were victims because in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, that's one thing he alluded to, that when they took away the strong men, I mean, if you came to a town, you took all the strong men that's supposed to be making the farm and building the houses, and you are leaving the children, the weak, and everybody else.
Right.
I mean, the people you left behind become more of a victim.
Right.
Elder Joseph Kokro said, my main takeaway in tonight's discussion is that history is what history is, or was not meant to please everyone. And that's what history is. And I said that in the advertisement, that history is, we say as it is, it's not to make you feel comfortable, it's what happened. And that's what we're talking about. Let me bring on Keseli Double, if you will not make fuss with us tonight. Keseli, you are live.
I love the call anybody, so don't call my name.
All right.
Thank you so much. And I want to say I appreciate Sis Kau very much for the show tonight. I don't even know how to say thanks to her. But my question I was asking was that is there any way you can compile all of these things and make a book so that we can have access to this thing? Because most of the history on Liberia that are out there are not in full, they are not in detail, like the way you are explaining them. So is there any way you can put all the knowledge together? Though I know the book is going to be voluminous, but is there any way you can do that? So that
we can do it in series.
Exactly. In that way you can make more money, say, while at the same time we're getting the knowledge so that the knowledge can, most time when knowledge are given free, that people don't respect it. So I think if you try to do it in writing and add a cost to it, it can benefit thousands of Liberians out there, not just one.
Thank you, Keseli. Thank you. Carl, before you respond, our YouTube followers say, would love to find out more about my grandfather and his brother travel back. How do I go about this? And please, what's your name and who is your grandfather, so that we can be able to flesh that out. Carl, your response to Kessley.
Yeah. So I am working on a book, but it's not. It's more of a novel, a historical novel. But that will be my first book project. I haven't really thought about compiling these things into a book. We've got a lot of up and coming historians. My purpose for sharing this information is just because I think it's necessary for people to start to understand why the world is organized the way it is. I think there's a healing process that you go through when you start to understand the past, and you will become less tribalistic. You'll become less, less of a separatist. You'll become more patriotic. You'll start to love yourself, your people, your country, your neighbors more, the more you know about them and the more you know about yourselves. And one thing history has taught me is, more than anything, is the oneness of the people we call Liberia, and the beautiful narrative that brought us all together. I don't believe that if our full and complete story were told through a curriculum from elementary school through college, getting progressively more complex as you get older, I don't believe we would have ever had a civil war. I don't believe we would have ever had a coup. I think that people would have understood how progress was made and what is possible, and would have had more stake in the country and understood that all of our ancestors participated in establishing, maintaining the sovereignty of this country from England, from France, from invaders. And I think if we understood that story, everyone would have understood in 1980, whether there's elitism or classism or not, everyone has a stake, and we're going to fight for it without destroying it. The same way they do in America, teach everyone as much as they can, and therefore people make progress through processes that don't destroy the state.
Yeah.
And that is why the country was destroyed, is because a lot of Liberians didn't feel that they were Liberian, and they should have. Because the fact of the matter is, Liberia would not have existed without the descendants of the sovereign Africans consenting to it and fighting for it. Those frontier forces that defended our borders, those frontier forces that kept Nimba and Lofa in the territory out of Guinea, were the sons and daughters, the descendants of those sovereign Africans that were in the territory before 1822. And we have to acknowledge that. And if we understood that, we would not be in the situation we're in.
Yeah. Jeremiah Bayoga Sr., you're live.
Thank you, Brother Dennis. Thank you so much, Mr. Carl. I have been following this program ever since. But what I'm about to say, I kind of try to buttress what the fellow who just spoke. Let me put it in the form of an appeal. I'm just appealing to you to make this book in the form of a textbook that will be introduced to Liberian students. Let's wait for the greater good. When somebody was saying, someone will buy it, okay, I don't want this to just stop as far as Facebook, because in America we got internet 24/7, so we alone will just benefit. But I want schools, students in Liberia, if they made that, someone always have to sponsor your trip over there, and they would need for education that this will be introduced in Liberian schools. Or do you have anything to say about that?
Thank you, Mr. Bayoga. And let me add that before you go, is we want others to even take on the project. Focus on Liberia has over 1,000 videos. We need people to say, well, I'll take this on to transcribe these videos into text.
Okay.
And that could be a good starting point. But I'm not saying your appeal. I'm just saying because other people have approached me to do that. So if people can come together and do some of these things, that will help. Carl, the book business still behind you.
Let me finish. I'm working on a book titled The Road to Dukor. Hopefully that will be out before the end of the year. And it's a novel, but that's not this subject matter. We have a lot of historians, emerging historians, my friend Jacine Carr, Dr. Burroughs, Dr. Dunn, Dr. Guanu. We have historians. They've written textbooks. We need to have a forum. The Ministry of Education needs to put people together, and we need to revamp the curriculum. There needs to be a collective effort to not necessarily rewrite, but to document things holistically.
Yeah.
And a full story, representing the full spectrum of our history from the perspective of a people. The people's history of Liberia needs to be written in a complete manner, one that does not exclude people, so that everyone can understand their role and feel a part of the process that created the state. And yes, I agree with everyone that needs to be done. It's certainly the responsibility of the professional career historians that have come out of Liberia to do so.
Thank you. Few more comments here. This one from Idols Black Jules Sully. Call's ancestors were smart. She's in America now. The slaves her ancestors sold, built the country she's in now. So it's all good.
Wait, what?
He said, when they were talking about collective guilt, he said, well, Call's ancestors sold the slaves. The slaves came here and built the land, which is America. And she's in the country now, so everything's canceled out. It's all good.
So I think more of us probably were sold than what we sold. But the bottom line is that those of us from Pella, Mano, a lot of the ethnic groups, we were not the ones trading on the coast. We were not the ones transporting people to the ships, but we were the ones fighting wars that supplied the human chattel. So everyone along the chain has, their role that they played.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
mind you, I just want to interject. So the chaos was as such that as you fight wars and you take captives, you yourselves are being captured. So everyone was a victim. I mean, you do a DNA, I did a DNA test. It's a long story, but yeah, some of my people were sold into slavery as well. So it is something that is, I have descendants of my ancestors who are DNA cousins of mine that are living in the United States, the Caribbean. So a lot of people, especially along that St. John River corridor more recently, through Trade Town, because people are up the St. John River going up into Guinea. They brought those people to the coast and sold them. Their victims were also brought to the coast and sold. So it's a profound, confusing, complex situation, the slave trade.
Telly Brown said, have you been attacked by African Americans for their forefathers being sold into slavery? He said he has been.
Well, like I just said, no Black person that was sold into slavery is a descendant of innocent people, only innocent people. And let me tell you why. The very able people who Dahomey people captured and sold into slavery in mass were also from an empire called Oyo. An Oyo empire was built on slavery. So you've got people in America that are descendants of slave raiders and people who were sold into slavery. History is complex, especially African Americans who are the intermarriage of many, many different types of Africans. You've got Fulani people who are a huge percentage of the people who were sold into slavery in the latter part. But in the earlier part of the slave trade, they were the main perpetrators. It was not until the Soso and others rose up against them along with the Mandingos, and then they even sold the king and the prince and the royalty into slavery. So
hundreds of years, things the pendulum going to change, right?
If you were sold into slavery, it's because you yourself descend from slave raiders. Yeah. So the process is a complex thing. I mean, the simple way that people look at history is a bit strange to me, because how can you think that you were just sitting down innocently and none of your people were? Warfare is a two-way street. And people defended themselves, and out of self-defense, you capture people. And out of, sometimes preemptive strikes are a way of defending yourself as well. So it was chaotic.
And Carl, that's why I always like to point to the Liberian Civil War, because I saw it, right? Because when it started, first it started with President Doe being in power, and there was a coup attempt. People attempted coup counter coup, and so things became rough. So by 1985, 86, 87, it was like Nimba and Grandjide, right? And so the war came, people say, well, we were across the border, and so we're going to avenge. We want to come back. And so there was war, and they were looking for Crown people, Mandingo people. And then other people came. So by the end of the whole war, almost everybody was in. We had the Loma Defense Force. Even in my town, they had defense force to defend against the onslaught of the LPC. So everybody became involved. And all these people, including people from my hometown, committed atrocities in the defense of themselves.
Yeah.
So if you have to think about it, and this slavery that lasted hundreds of years, I mean, what do you expect? Even the weakest among them will get to fight.
And culturally, we're really good at revenge, eh? And I always tell people, revenge is not self-defense, but we're very good at revenge. We had to forget. We're the land of 500-year grudges. The 500 years ago, you killed my great grandfather. I will avenge him. That's
the Chinese.
The Chinese got it from us. They got it from us. We're the originators. I'm telling you. And so a lot of these things, even the conflicts between ethnic groups today, we might not know, but they're ancient.
Yeah,
they're ancient. The conflict between Fulani and what we call Mandingo, the Manding people, that's an old conflict that stems from slavery. You have two massive empires that clashed, a couple of centuries ago.
Yeah.
And the remnants of those people, their descendants are still angry. You go to Guinea, their descendants are still angry. They cannot even articulate the historic source of the rage. It stems from slavery.
Thank you. This is a very important question from Abby Tyler. So if we're taking away the collective guilt from one group, can we stop blaming the Congo people from everything that is wrong with Liberia?
I mean, I don't know what kind of intelligent person would be blaming any one group for things that are wrong with Liberia. But yeah, I agree with you. Anyone who's blaming one group for anything wrong with Liberia is doing it out of intent, not because they actually believe that. It's just that doesn't even make any sense.
Right. And
but
everything that is wrong, that's one group. Nobody should think that way. Because
right.
All right. And the follow who posted about his grandfather. He said his grandfather is Akolasi and John Henry Ricks. So it's something that we can look into.
Oh, the Ricks. Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of information on the Ricks.
Yeah. Priscilla Kuya said, thanks, Carl, for sharing. Stephen Elsa, I salute you, Carl, for pointing out the importance of inserting this kind of history in our Liberian K-12 curriculum and how it can strengthen our spirit of national beauty and patriotism. Thanks for the good work. And I said it before, how can we even go through war and still our curriculum does not address anything of that nature? I mean, how can we have all these problems and our school system does not think about fixing them? How can we have the hydro dry up every year and we can still train people that can build hydro? We can train people that can do the generator is killing people. We can still train people that can do solar panel. Why? But anyway,
the power issue in Liberia, the electricity issue is a mafia conspiracy, but that's a different show. That thing had nothing to do. That one is deliberate. Let me tell you that today. It's deliberate. Somebody's benefiting from fuel consumption. And until that's resolved, our power crisis will not be resolved. I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. And thank you, FF Fly JC. Say I share FOL my channel in a playlist on Liberia. Thank you. And somebody was thinking like me when you said we hold grudges. And I said it was the Chinese who said you killed my
I got it from a kung fu movie. That's why. I used to watch kung fu with my big brother when I was growing up. So 5,000 years ago, you killed my father, my grandfather, or whatever. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Carl, for coming tonight. I know we're going to continue on this, and we are inviting historians from different walks of life to come and join us on the Liberian History
Absolutely.
Channel, and let's do this. 3 years ago, we started a series on the ethnic groups of Liberia. We did a couple of them, and
Ah.
we couldn't even find someone from the Day ethnic group. We could to do something. So from what I learned, they may be extinct very soon if we don't kind of do this kind of thing. So, but thank you very much. Let me get your closing comments as we end the show today.
My closing comments are that our history of, I've been studying African world history with an emphasis on the transatlantic slave trade pretty much my entire life. I mean, since I was in middle school. And there's no country, there are no people on the planet with a more interesting history, with a more profound history, with a more Pan-African history, with a more empowering history than that of Liberians. And we were born of the necessity of African liberation and African self-determination. And the circumstances that created the Republic of Liberia, those circumstances still exist. Liberia is still necessary, and we have to study it, and we have to manifest the destiny, the profound destiny that was laid out for us. We have not attained Liberia yet. It is something we should still work towards. So it's not that we're a failed state. No, we are a state, a work in progress. We have to understand who we are and where we stand in the global picture and where we must go. We are the ones that are destined to lead the way, to be the example of liberated, free African people. And the more we learn about ourselves, the more we respect ourselves, and the more we'll step up and do what we're supposed to do to carry ourselves and the future generations forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Famula. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., we're going to have the Justice Forum. Our discussion will be discussing the Liberian civil justice system versus the criminal justice system. You don't want to miss that. And also, not tomorrow, sorry about that. Next week, we're going to have the transitional justice. We're going to be discussing transitional justice. Someone asked me, is peace possible in Liberia? Can we have peace? I say, well, I know who to answer that question. I'm going to call people that are doing their PhD in transitional justice, Tene Dalie and Amos Weah, and they will be joined by former TRC Commissioner Marcel Washington. So keep tuned. Also, tomorrow we're going to have On Point. On Point at 4 o'clock, they will be discussing Liberian domestic debt payment and other current issues will be discussed on Point. Keep it here on Focus on Liberia, where we educate, we elevate, and promote all things Liberia. Also on the Hour of Politics with Mr. Ansoni CA on Monday, he's going to be hosting the 2023 legislative aspirant, Mr. Sylvester Wamplu. He is running for the House, and he will be here on the Hour of Politics Monday, 1 p.m. right here on Focus on Liberia. Carl, we can thank you enough for coming. We want to also thank our viewers for always watching Focus on Liberia. Continue to support us. We are the only platform this is the only platform that will do things like this. So please, always support us, share the video, and if possible, give us some money so that we can push our vision of establishing a radio and TV station in Liberia. Somebody asking Carl, which language do you speak? All right, well, that will be in our next show.
He's asking me, do I speak any language? Like I'm speaking a language now. Like, what is that?
But,
do I speak any Liberian language dialect? Ah, I see.
All right, yeah, well, keep that. I'll let him come back next week, and we're going to address that. In fact, we're going to
leave me alone.
Yeah, we're going to address that. But we're going to close now with our song that says, we are all Liberian. Whether your ancestors sold slaves or participated in anything in the selling of slaves, we are all Liberians. Whether your ancestors came on the boat or they walk through the bushes, or they came on the bridge, or any of those ships, we are all Liberians. And the reason for which Liberia was set up is to be an asylum country for all free people. If we are, how far or how close are we from the objective? That's what you and I are supposed to be working on as of tonight. That's why we always end with the song that says, we are all Liberians. Have a good night and God bless you.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home.